very typical. Notice that we have IB outlet here, and we've seen this in a number of examples in past weeks. This is my mechanism for actually linking my code to the UI image view so that I can actually apply that recognizer and listen for those finger touches. Good question. So pinching is going to pretty much similar in spirit, even though some of the function calls will be a little bit different. Let me scroll this over just a bit. And handle pinch is the method that's going to get invoked when you're using the two finger to go separate or closer together. And now we have this first. I'm declaring a CG float struct. So again, here too, it looks like a class, looks like an object thereof, but this is again just capitalized to be consistent with Apple's tradition for C style structures. This is a CG float, which is just some representation of a floating point value. CG affine transform scale is doing a line of code similar to before, where we take the current scale and multiply it by some factor. And notice that the factor has been passed in to us. So one of the things this recognizer does is it figures out how far away did your fingers move in that split second of time, and then it informs this method what that difference is so that you can scale accordingly. Then if we look down here, we're doing a translation. This time we're not actually moving Rob, because recall we only want to move Rob when we're panning, not when we're pinching. So he's going to stay put but grow from wherever my fingers are moving closer or farther away from each other. And then we apply these two things again, much like we did previously. And then lastly, all we do is remember that change in scale so that when I do it again, he doesn't snap back to the default 1.0 resolution to start anew. All right. Any questions then? So we've seen some building blocks now for swiping, up, down, left, right, for touching, for pinching, for clicking and dragging. And so with those, for your third project, if you choose to do something in iOS that actually has UI interactions beyond what's possible out of the box with Interface Builder, realize that these are the basic building blocks even for, say, a simple game. And we'll put these to the test later tonight when we implement an age-old game of sorts. All right. And you might see an allusion to it right there. All right. So, questions on the basics of graphics before we move on to things that are useful to have in your toolkit. But then we'll come back full circle to the application of two-dimensional graphics, actually moving on their own without human interaction. OK, so a design question then. So totally changing gears for just a moment. Localization refers to what process when writing code? OK, internationalization. So not just naively assuming that every one of your users is going to speak English and read English, but rather might have some other native tongue. And you might want to cater to that audience so that they actually download your app, use your app, can understand your app, whatever the reasons. But this is problematic because we've gotten into the habit thus far of writing quite a lot of code in what's essentially English, since Apple came from the US, but also quite a lot of strings, quite a lot of NS strings inside of double quotes, maybe prefixed with an @ sign. So this is kind of problematic because I feel like if I want to suddenly support Mandarin or Spanish or any other language to which I might want to localize my application, now I have to do a whole lot of copy-paste. And any file that has a quoted string like hello world, I'm going to apparently need to copy my viewcontroller.h and maybe make a separate one for each language, viewcontroller.m, a separate one for languages. Like, surely this isn't the way. Because if there's some 50, 60 languages you might even want to support, I mean, that's a nightmare to have that much code lying around, if only because now if you want to make a change, you have to make it in dozens of places. So what's a smarter approach? And let me preface this with someone who's never internationalized an application before. How would you go about solving this problem? All right. Mm-hmm.
So you potentially store all the strings that you want in p-lists and then just load it from the p-list in your file, and I think it would automatically do it if you say like this p-list is for US version, this p-list is for German version.
Uh-huh.
And then I think it might automatically just do that based on what the user's language is set.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. And the principle that I'll highlight there is the fact that you're proposing that we factor out the strings. So you can write all of your code in English or pseudo-English in Objective-C or C or whatever the language is. But if you at least factor out the strings that have to change based on the user's end language by putting them in some central file, now you can keep separate your code, your business logic, so to speak, from your actual data. In this case, the strings that the user sees. So you're indeed right. The way Apple typically does this for desktop or iOS applications is you have a plist file, which is just an XML file underneath the hood. But so far as we care, it's just a text file that we can therefore edit. And if we have a separate file for English, a separate file for Mandarin, a separate file for Spanish, we can essentially tell iOS, the operating system, depending on what language the user's iPhone or iPad is in, load the appropriate plist file for me. So in fact, you've seen a few different things. We'll use a file that typically ends in .strings, but it's the same exact idea. And it's even simpler than a plist in that we just write things in the form of text, no XML whatsoever. So let's go ahead and do an example here. Let me open up Xcode, create a new project with just a single view. Let me then proceed to name this, let's say, Hola 1. I'll bias things toward English and Spanish for now. I'm going to go ahead and leave automatic reference counting checked. I'm going to leave everything else unchecked. I'm going to go ahead and click Next. I'm going to go ahead and save this on my desktop. And now I have the simplest of applications, which, recall, if I run it, just gives me a big white box in the form of an application that looks like this. So very underwhelming, but let's make it a little sexier by going into the nib file. Let me go ahead and drag a label into the middle. Just so I can support iPhone 4 and iPhone 5s. Let me go ahead and click down here, if you haven't noticed this little control bar, and turn on a constraint called vertical center. This will ensure that whatever simulator you're using or whatever device you're using, at least this text will be vertically centered. And by default, let me go ahead and just make the American centric version, Hello World. All right, so now notice what I have in the left-hand side of my screen. All of the familiar files. The program happens to be called Hola, but that's just because I wrote that. Nothing has been actually internationalized yet. But those are all pretty much familiar files. In particular, notice that there's just a single nib file. But if I now want to localize this application, we can do the following. And unfortunately, this feature changes location with every version of Xcode, it seems. But if I go ahead and click on the project at top left, then click on the project to the right of that, you'll notice down here that there's a screen related to localizations, aka internationalization. And if I go ahead and click the plus here, I have a whole bunch of languages that Xcode supports nicely right out of the box. I'm going to go ahead and choose Spanish. And if I zoom out, I'm now being prompted to do a couple of things. Choose files and reference language to create Spanish localization. So it turns out that by default, there's two different files that can take on some other language. One is the nib file, apparently, and one is a file called info plist.strings. So I'm not going to touch the latter just yet. I'm going to uncheck it and come back to that. But I am going to tell Xcode to localize my nib file. So if I go down here to finish, what I now get is both English and Spanish. And if I go back to my nib, notice that by default, I still see Hello World. But notice what's different about the nib at top left. Yeah, it looks like it's become a hierarchy of sorts. If I expand this triangle, I seem to have English, which is what I had a moment ago, and then I have Spanish, which is apparently the same. OK, so it actually hasn't done any translation for me. That's for a human to actually do. But I can go into this nib now, and I can say something like, Hola, mundo. Change it there, save it, and now I have my English version and my Spanish version. So let's see what now happens. I'm going to go back to the simulator. Or rather, let me go ahead and spawn the simulator by running the code. It's been built. It's being installed into the simulator. And when it comes to the foreground, we should see Hello World. Now let me disclaim, about every fifth time I try this on different computers, it doesn't work. So if it blows up, realize I've issued a disclaimer, which means it's OK. But if I now go here, these are just all the applications we've been installing in recent weeks. I'm going to right-click over to the settings. And if you've never done this on your own phone or iPad, you can go to General, International, Language. And I'm going to choose Español for Spanish. Done. It's going to change language, ... Xcode's going to crash because it doesn't like it when you do that with it still running. But I'm going to go ahead now and rerun the simulator. And now we have a Spanish version of the application. So the only thing that's changed, crash aside, is that I changed the settings in my application to actually be Spanish instead of English. And if I went back to English, I should hopefully see hello world instead. But a couple of things haven't changed. In particular, what's the name of this application apparently? So it's still Hola 1. So irrespective of the language my phone is configured with, the application is still the same. And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe you want the game to be called Angry Birds no matter what the language actually is. Or maybe you want to localize that too. So you can do that in different places. So let me actually go ahead and open up a second example here whereby we start fresh. Single view application. Hola 2 will be this application. Whoops. And save it on the desktop. And let's do something that's almost the same, but this time I want to do a little bit more in code. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my nib file. This time I'm going to drag my label, and I'm not going to hard code it into the nib, because recall that if we do a little bit more programming, we can actually control that label programmatically from code. So if I want to do this, let me make sure things line up with the online code so that you can play along at home after. If I want to actually do this, what's the first thing I need to do to wire my code up to my nib file? Because recall, all I have is the empty boilerplate code thus far. Yeah?
You need to create an IB outlet.
OK, so I need to create an IB outlet. It likely belongs in what file? OK, so somewhere in the view controller. And early on, recall that we put almost all of our properties just by convention into the .h file. But then gradually last week, we started moving more and more of our properties and method declarations into the .m file, the implementation file, just because there's really no reason to inform the whole world what our private implementation details are. So I'll go ahead and open up viewcontroller.m, and I can implement this inside of my nameless category. So I'm going to declare a property with a few attributes, but we'll come back to that. It's going to be a UI label, and I'll just call this label. Now I need a couple of more things. If this is going to be an IB outlet, I need to say IB outlet. And what attributes would be appropriate for this outlet, for this IB outlet? Well, one is always easy. We haven't seen atomic, so non-atomic is fine. We're not writing multi-threaded code here within this application. Read-only or read-write? The goal is to recreate the Hello World application, by this time in code, telling it what to say, either Hello World or Hola Mundo. OK, so read-write, since I want to be able to change what it's pointing at. And then lastly, I can actually go with weak. So we haven't spent too much time on this, but recall that strong versus weak somehow relates to how the pointers are going to be dealt with. And in this case, weak suffices, because all I need is a pointer to a UI label. But I'm not the owner of that UI label per se. The owner is really the nib file. And when the nib is loaded, it will take care of ensuring that the RAM that's necessary to store that label on the screen will be allocated by it. I am just some other guy, viewcontroller.m, that similarly wants to talk to that pointer, but it's not really mine per se, so weak suffices. Someone else owns it. I did not instantiate it myself. It came from the nib. So after this, I now have programmatic access to the label. So what do I want to do? Well, I'm going to get rid of the did receive memory warning. There's not much we can do if this application runs out of memory, because there's terribly little going on, just that UI label. And I am going to put some additional code into viewDidLoad. First, again, by convention, I'm going to call the parent class's viewDidLoad method, whatever that happens to do. And when this view loads, so when the nib is loaded from disk, and the rectangle is constructed, and that UI label is placed in the middle of the screen, I want to do one last configuration detail, namely self.label.text. .text is what's actually inside of that label, is going to get, and this is the new part, ns localized string. And now, according to Xcode's prompts here, it wants a key and or a comment. So I somehow need to provide it with an identifier for that string. It doesn't want me to put, for instance, hello world per se, but rather a generic key that's going to be defined in two different places, two separate files, so that I can look up that value dynamically. So comment, I'm going to actually leave nil. Comment is just for really the humans doing the translations. If you can use tools to automatically generate a file we're about to generate manually, so that if you are the programmer who maybe only speaks English, but you want to tell other developers who actually speak multiple languages what this string represents, you can do it in the form of a comment there, so that when they automatically generate the file we're about to generate manually, they know what you mean by that key. So I'm going to choose something arbitrary but sensible, like greeting. So quote unquote greeting is not what I want the user to see. It's just going to be a key into a table of strings. So to create this, I'm going to go up to File, New, File. And we haven't seen this one before, but if you poke around, you'll start seeing some other useful things. If I go to Resource, notice there's a few resources here. Property list we've seen before. Strings file is another. And according to the description, it is an empty strings file. It's just a text file. So let's go ahead and click Next. By default, I'm going to